Hey everybody, it's Blake. Today we're going to be talking about answering critiques or Ks. If you haven't seen the intro to K video, or if you're not familiar with what a critique is, I'd strongly recommend that you watch that video first, because this is going to be building directly off of what we talked about in that video. Um, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I think it's best to start with a quick review of what the parts of a K are. There are four main parts to a K. There's the link, which is what the AF did wrong, the impact, which is what happens as a result of the AF doing that wrong thing, the role of the ballot, which is the framing mechanism for the K that asks the question, what kind of impact can the debate ballot have? And then you have the alternative, or alt, which is an action that we can take to resolve the impact to lessen the conditions created by the impact described earlier in the critique. Um, so these are the basic parts of a K. Again, if that was quick for you or if that seemed really rushed, I recommend that you check out the intro to K video where we go over all four of these parts in greater detail. But I think that it makes the most sense to talk about answering Ks by talking about them piece by piece, how we answer each of these four parts of the critique. So we'll start with answering the link. So there's a number of arguments that you can make here. I've listed a couple of them. There's the no link argument, which in the context of a K says that the link evidence does not describe or apply to the AF. So you are accusing the AF of doing something that is, say, perpetuating militarism, when in reality the link that you're reading does not apply to the AF. The AF did not do the thing that the link says leads to more militarism. You can also make a non-unique argument against the link, which is saying that the link will happen anyway. It's not a unique harm of the AF. Like, this is a really persuasive argument when it comes to Ks because we're talking about larger structural problems, and so it's probably true that if the AF doesn't cause the structural problem to get stronger, something else will. You know, if the resolution doesn't say that we need to increase military funding, probably at some point there will be an increase in military funding. So non-unique arguments against the link of a K are pretty persuasive a lot of the time. You can also make link mitigation arguments. So similar to how impact mitigation says that it's not that big of an impact, link mitigation says it's not that big of a link. What the AF did was so minor, is such a minor offense that nothing will actually change. It's not going to amount to like a brink, going over the brink to create unlivable conditions. You can also make a link turn, which in the case of a K is saying that the AF actually resolves the impact that is being described. If you can think of a way to make that argument, it's actually very, very persuasive. So a link turn on the K, saying that the AF actually solves what is being described by the link. And then lastly, if your opponent is reading a link of omission, which again is something that I explained in the intro to K video, you can make a theoretical argument and say that links of omission are bad, that the AF shouldn't lose just because they didn't mention every possible thing that they could mention. And this normally comes with some theory, standards, and voters about ground or strat skew or fairness, education, that kind of stuff. So this is a good way to up layer in the debate because a K a lot of the times is considered to be a higher layer than the resolution. So up layering by going for theory like links of omission bad is a good strategic decision if it applies to the scenario of the debate. So now let's talk about answering the impact. One thing that I wanted to clarify, because this is a point of confusion for a lot of people, when it comes to identity-based Ks, so the examples I gave last time were Ks based on critical race theory, ableism, feminism, queer theory, things of that nature. When it comes to those types of Ks, there's very little debate that happens on the impact level because the impacts of those types of Ks are often undeniable moral truth. Things like racism is bad that just simply should not be refuted. So a lot of times when it comes to identity Ks, the impact debate is pretty light. The only type of argument that you can kind of make against an identity K impact is that it's not a root cause. So we talked about root cause in the intro to K video as a strategic thing that is included in a lot of impacts to argue why that impact has to come first. So you might argue like, yeah, obviously ableism is bad, but it's not the root cause of other forms of violence, which means that other forms of violence should be considered when evaluating the round as well. Those are kind of the types of arguments that we are comfortable making against identity K impacts. But when it comes to structural Ks, things like, securitization and capitalism and things of that nature, we have a couple more options. For instance, we can go for impact turn, say capitalism is actually a good thing, militarism is actually a good thing. There's a lot of evidence out there that says this because obviously capitalism is a structure that continues to exist, so there must be somebody out there that's willing to defend it. There's also impact mitigation. You can just say that it does not actually result in much oppression or much negative effects. Again, these are for structural Ks, so this would be things like um, capitalism, securitization, militarization. There's one other example, but it's not coming to mind right now. So impact turn and impact mitigation are also possible against the impacts of these structural Ks. Now, on the role of the ballot, if you went for a no root cause argument, which you can make against identity Ks and structural Ks, they apply to both. If you go for a no root cause argument, the role of the ballot is strongly indicated to not be a top priority for the judge anymore. So if you made a no root cause argument, use that as your segue into the role of the ballot debate to say that because, whatever it is, capitalism is not the root cause of all violence, because that is not the case, the role of the ballot that says that we should only focus on capitalism is false, because instead we should be focusing on other forms of violence, because getting rid of capitalism doesn't necessarily remove the cause of other violence if capitalism is not the cause of other violence. Other types of arguments that you can make are theoretical arguments. Again, this is your chance to uplayer. So you can ask the question of yourself during prep time, does the role of the ballot limit ground or make the entire 1AC useless? Is it a Stratsky argument that, you read an entire case that's focused on the environment, and then they get up and say the only thing that matters is, queer discrimination? Doesn't that make the entirety of the 1AC useless, and doesn't that kind of seem like an unfair strategic move for the NC to make? So maybe that's ground for some theoretical arguments. You can also make a on-layer turn to say that the role of the ballot is actually exclusionary. So this kind of asks the question, what kind of impacts does the role of the ballot ignore? If your AF, for say, talks about ableism, and then the role of the ballot is just about queer discrimination, then you can say that it's probably a bad thing that the neg is essentially saying that ableist violence doesn't matter or shouldn't matter in the context of debate. That's probably a pretty persuasive turn against the role of the ballot. And just like with any framing mechanism, you can always provide your own counter framing mechanism, a counter role of the ballot. But remember that if you read a counter role of the ballot, you want to avoid the arguments that you made. So if you said that like the role of the ballot shouldn't be focused on one form of violence or that's exclusionary, then make sure that your role of the ballot doesn't stay focused on one form of violence as well. Now let's talk about answering the alt. The number one tool we have against the K is a perm, which is an argument that we can make against the alt. It is a hypothetical argument saying why can't the alternative, the thing that solves the problem, coexist with the AF? And this is such an important tool, and it's so effective that it gets its own slide where I'll talk about a little bit more about what a perm is and how to make a perm. But for now, just make note of every time you are debating a K, I want you to make a perm. Make a perm every time you are debating a K. That is going to be the number one piece of advice I can give you to make you perform better in debates where you have to answer a K. The next type of argument that you can make against an alt is that the alt links into the K. So the link evidence in the round a lot of times is kind of generic because it's saying something like using the government is a link or something along those lines. So does the alt use the government as well? In which case, don't they just perpetuate the problems that they claim to solve? If that is the case, then the name of that argument is that the alt links into the K as well, and that is an effective way to take out an entire K if you can find a persuasive reason why that would be the case. You can also make the claim that the alt doesn't solve. This is a very common argument against mindset alts because remember, mindset alts are more abstract than the pragmatic types of alts, which again is covered in the Intro to K video. So if you can argue that the alt doesn't actually do anything, why would we vote for it, right? Just like taking out solvency on an AF. If the alt doesn't solve, I don't vote on it. The next type of argument that you can make is that the alt is not feasible, especially for pragmatic alts. This is kind of the pragmatic version of the alt doesn't solve. It's a little bit more specific in saying that the alt is trying to do something literal in the world, affect literal world change that is observable, but that would never actually happen in the real world. So if you can make an alt is not feasible argument, that functions very similar in taking out the solvency of the alt. And the last type of argument that I have listed here is, again, a theoretical argument, a way to uplayer on the K debate, which is vague alts are bad. If they are reading a vague alt, as in something vague like decolonize education, instead of something more pragmatic that can be measured, you can say vague alts are a voting issue because isn't it unfair that they essentially have such an amorphous solution that they can reword it in any way they want in the 2N to make it solve for whatever thing that they originally maybe didn't solve for, or maybe they explained it one way in the first speech and another way in the second speech, and because it was worded so vaguely in the original speech that it's not necessarily a contradiction. There's all sorts of scenarios in which vague alts can be unfair or uneducational, so if you can make a theoretical argument for why vague alts are bad, that's another good way to outlayer. So now let's talk about perms. So a permutation, definitionally, is a combination with a specific order. So you might have heard this in math class or logic class or anything like that. A permutation is just a combination with a specific order. In the context of debate, a permutation is a thought experiment. It is a hypothetical claim. Why can't the alternative in the affirmative exist in the same world? It is not a new advocacy. Some people think that saying perm means that now your advocacy, now voting AF, includes getting the alt. That is not the case. A perm is just saying that hypothetically they could both exist, so there's no harm in doing the AF. So for this reason, do not make the mistake of thinking that saying perm wins the round, because you still need to win a reason why you would vote for the AF, because voting for the AF does not get you the alt. Voting for the AF just doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility of the alt happening. I know that's a little bit complicated, but I encourage you to, if that didn't make sense, listen back over to it 1 or 2 times. This is a really important distinction. A lot of people will lose rounds and they'll say, hey, but I made a perm, so didn't I get access to all of the K solvency? No, because a perm is not an advocacy. You still need to prove to me why I should vote AF at the end of the debate. So once you understand that, let's talk about actually making a perm in the context of a round. So one thing that you want to be careful for is some people will put preempts to perms in their alt. They'll say, and the alt is incompatible with state action or something like that, which says that there's no way that it can coexist with the AF. So make sure that you answer those arguments or address them in the process of making the perm, just to make sure that you don't waste your time making this argument. But every time that you make a perm, it's going to be 3 steps. You're going to name it, describe it, and prefer. So first, you're going to name the perm. What kind of perm is it? There's a lot of different types of perms, because remember, a perm, short for permutation, is just a combination with a specific order. So can we do both at the same time? Do we do the AF and then later on we can do the alt? Or do we do the AF with the mindset of the alt maybe? There's all sorts of different combinations and ways that 2 actions can go together. But as long as the AF comes first, and at the end of the debate I have to sign AF in order to prove the perm correct, then it is a valid perm. So you're going to name it by saying perm do both, or maybe perm do AF with the mindset of the alt. And then you're going to describe it. Tell me what the world of the perm looks like in practical terms. It's not enough to just say perm do both. I don't know what doing both means. You need to explain to me why both things can coexist at the same time and what the world would look like as a result of them coexisting. And then lastly, you're going to give me a reason to prefer the perm to just doing the alt by itself. Why would I not just vote neg and get access to the alt? What part of the AF is still worth my time that I want to vote AF and just say we can hypothetically do the alt at the same time, or hypothetically do the alt a little bit later? This is the part that makes the perm a voting issue. If you just say perm, you are not winning the round. You need to give me a reason why I should prefer both the AF and the neg as opposed to just the alt. If you don't do that, you can't win off the perm, but if you do that, then the perm is a voting issue, and it is one of the only arguments in debate that can function as a silver bullet. A perm is an argument that can win you the K with just that one argument. Now, I'm not saying that you should only make a perm, but I'm saying that in the worst case scenario where you're really crunched for time and can only go for one argument, you can win the K just by going for the perm. But you have to make sure that you are doing all 3 of these steps. Name it, describe it, and prefer. So those are all of the parts of the K. Some final thoughts. I just want to emphasize one more time. Every single time you answer a K, you should be making a perm. A perm is a thought experiment, so there's a lot of different ways that we can approach, where we can use our thought process to approach the perm in a different way. There's always a way to make a perm against a K. You just need to be a little bit creative sometimes in how you do it. Now, an organizational note, do your best to go top down, but if you're in a really serious time crunch and you don't have that much time to answer the K, lead with the perm, because like I said, that could be your silver bullet argument, and then go back and go for link arguments. A lot of times perm and the link are where most of the debate actually happens, so those are the 2 most important things to get out on the flow. Additionally, if you're ever struggling to come up with arguments against a K, because a lot of Ks sound really good on paper, imagine what the K would look like in the real world. place it in the context of the real world and imagine how it would function. A lot of times that's where these things fall apart, because we can talk in abstract about, how to solve things like racism and ableism and sexism, but these things have persisted for a very long time. So in the context of the real world, why do these things continue to persist, and how does the K not resolve those issues? So remember, if you're ever struggling for arguments, remember to take the K off of paper, out of the abstract, and place it in the real world, and think of it that way. And lastly, keep layering in mind, like I mentioned, a lot of times the K is considered a higher layer than the AF or the resolution itself, topical debate. But you can actually up layer by going for theoretical arguments, but you will have to make a claim that, theory comes before K. But that's a great way to make it so that you don't need to win the K necessarily to win the round. So keeping layering in mind is a great strategic backdoor to make sure that you can always win a debate, even if you don't necessarily win the K flow. So, just like I could talk about Ks and the strategy of Ks for a long time, I could talk about answering them for just as long, but I think that this is the best place to stop. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and have a good rest of your day.